John got into anything, two-faced, heavy. Call my mama. I wasn't there. And that's like my biggest regret, that I wasn't there for him.
He saw the vehicle pull up. He instantly hears gunfire. Just shooting.
When you're in a relationship that is hostile and volatile and unpredictable and unsafe, you do reach a breaking point.
People do act different ways. People may be frightened, people may be angry.
It's not about love anymore. It's about property, what's mine.
17 shell casings tell a story within itself, right? It says someone wanted someone dead.
August 27th, 2017. Around 1:30 a.m., police in Detroit, Michigan respond to the scene of a terrifying car accident.
A 911 call was placed because a vehicle had crashed into a church. One of the walls in the parking lot, a vehicle had driven through the wall of the parking lot, and they believe they saw a person inside the vehicle.
Responders get to the scene, and they notice a 20-something-year-old man slumped over, barely breathing.
At those hours, it's typically pretty quiet. The person was driving eastbound on Mack Avenue. It looks like they lost control around this location. You can see the tires in the grass. He went through a 3-foot high brick wall, and then his vehicle came to a rest in a parking lot.
Upon closer inspection, officers spot evidence of a reason for the crash.
They notice bullet holes on the driver's side of the vehicle, as well as blood dripping from the man's body.
EMS now arrives and discovers that the person is shot. There's a chest wound. Now it's turning into a different investigation.
First responders are able to identify him as 29-year-old Jonte Brooks. They jump into action, and they rush him to the hospital because they try to save this man's life.
Jonte Maurice Lewis Brooks was born in 1988. His mother, Teresa Brooks, had him when she was little more than a child herself.
Jonte is my firstborn. I was really happy when he first got home, and my mom took care of him because I was just 17. So she took care of us together, you know.
Jonte grew up in a loving, close-knit family. He had 3 brothers, 1 sister. Unfortunately, Jonte's father was not in the picture, so he took it upon himself at a very early age to be the man of the family.
In high school, Jonte's charm made him popular with the girls in his class. But he only had eyes for one young woman in particular, named Dewayna.
He can stay away from her, she can stay away from him. So they were right together. They had a great relationship. They went to the prom together. It's beautiful.
They were head over heels in love with each other, and they were overjoyed when they had their first child. Not having a father in his life, Jonte took the role of being a father very seriously. So he was a very active dad.
Although they never married, the couple went on to have 4 more children together, and Jonte worked hard to support them.
Jonte eventually figured out that he thrived working with his hands and landed a career in landscaping. He took a lot of pride in his work and creating beautiful landscapes for all of his clients.
Settling down at such a young age sometimes put a strain on the relationship. But the couple always seemed to work things out.
They broke up for a second, and then they got right back together. And I knew that it was just love. They couldn't stay away from each other.
However, during one of their breaks, Jonte fathered a child with another woman. Eventually, there was no more getting back together.
Even though he and the mom eventually went their separate ways, he still prioritized co-parenting and being there for all of his children.
He was a great dad. He went, picked them up, took them wherever he went, brought them over to the house, even if he wasn't going to be there. He still had the kids there, always.
Even if he wasn't with the mothers any longer, he was right there, being a great father figure for all of them.
Really proud of him because there's a lot of men out here that have kids and just don't even recognize them. He didn't have a lot, but for sure he had those kids with him by his side, whatever he was doing.
In the fall of 2016, Jonte decided to take another chance on love with 26-year-old Mignetta Yeager.
Mignetta actually pursued Jonte, and he found this really appealing because she would take the initiative. And so she would take him out on dates, pick him up for dates, pay for things, and this was unfamiliar to someone who had to provide for everyone in his life. They had a really happy relationship, always spending time together, going on dates, and just really excited about the future.
He actually thinks that she may potentially be the one. But as in oftentimes in cases like this, there's a hiccup along the way and the relationship begins to fade and it falls apart.
By 2017, Jonte had simplified his life, focusing on spending time with his children. But now, he's clinging to life. Detroit police have determined Jonte lost consciousness and crashed into a church after someone shot him. The question is who?
There's no guns in the car, there's no passenger in the vehicle, so obviously somebody from outside the vehicle fired into the car. We try to figure out, one is motive. Was this person an intentional target? Was it an accident?
Witnesses tell police a truck was pursuing Jonte shortly before he crashed.
Several witnesses noticed the white minivan seemed to be trying to get away from the red pickup truck. However, once the white minivan crashed into the church, the red pickup truck fled the scene. They were not able to see the license plate. However, they did notice there were two people in the vehicle, a man and a woman.
Unfortunately, none of them saw the shooting.
Officers surveyed the scene and noticed there are no shell casings at the church. They realized the shooting must have occurred somewhere else.
We would call that a two-part scene. The secondary crime scene would have been where he was found. The original crime scene would be where he was shot.
One theory was that this was possibly a road rage incident, because that's what normally happens if you see one vehicle chasing another down the road.
In that specific area, we haven't responded to too many homicides. There is a little bit of prostitution over there. There's some breaking and entering of automobiles and stolen cars and things of that nature. Now, the investigative wheels are spinning to where this could have happened at.
As officers are surveying the scene, they notice down the street at the gas station, there are multiple cars and blue flashing lights. And they wonder, is this part of the current scene?
In the early morning hours of August 17, 2017, Detroit police begin their investigation into the shooting of 29-year-old Jonte Brooks. Before they've even finished interviewing witnesses, they receive some tragic news.
Unfortunately, the paramedics were not able to save his life, and he does die at the hospital. He was killed from a single bullet that went through his right shoulder and went through his lungs.
So now you have a murder investigation. And now, where was he murdered?
Flashing lights from patrol cars at a gas station nearby tip off officers to the possible location.
Coincidentally, there's a crime scene just down the street. Second call that had come in for shots fired at the gas station. Officers at the scene were quickly able to determine that the two incidents were connected.
When investigators arrive, they find evidence of a relentless attack. 17 spent shell casings scattered on the ground.
Officers notice all 17 shell casings are the same, so they seemingly come from the same weapon, meaning there's probably just one shooter. After Jonte was shot, he tried to get away. Unfortunately, he succumbed to his injuries, swerved, and drove right into the church and crashed.
You have a two-part scene, so we would have to break those two up and then have evidence techs or our crime scene services section document each location.
17 shell casings tell a story within itself, right? It says someone wanted someone dead.
Officers talked to the gas station owner, and he says he then noticed a red pickup truck pull up and a white minivan pulled up right next to it. He heard some arguing and heard some gunshots, about 6 or 7 of them.
The owner tells police that when he ran to the window, he caught a glimpse of the shooter.
The gas station owner noticed it was a young black woman shooting at the white minivan. At this point, the white minivan pulled out and sped off. The woman followed, shooting on foot at the white minivan, then jumped back into the red pickup truck and tried to follow him.
Unfortunately, he's unable to provide a description of the driver or the license plate.
People don't look out the window and expect a homicide to happen and say, I'm documenting it step by step by step. I'm looking at my watch. Okay, it's now. They're not doing that. You know, you're busy doing this. All of a sudden you hear something, you look, and you only capture this much.
Luckily, the gas station has security cameras covering the entire area.
What's better than the witness account is the video at the store, which captures the event in its entirety from start to finish.
Officers review the surveillance footage, and they notice an older black man driving the vehicle and a young black woman in the passenger seat. She's on her phone, and she seems very animated as she's talking. At this point, a white minivan pulls up beside them with the window rolled down. They start to argue, and the young lady jumps out of the vehicle and starts shooting at the white minivan.
Based on the video footage, there wasn't any delay, there was no physical contact, there wasn't any of that.
The video provides investigators with enough information to identify the driver.
Not only does the surveillance footage show the shooting happening, it also reveals the license plate of the vehicle. They're able to tell the vehicle belongs to 44-year-old LeBaron Borum. The officers check his DMV photo, and they notice there is a resemblance to the person in the surveillance video. The officers also realize he lives in the neighborhood of the gas station.
From that, we did surveillance and were able to locate the vehicle parked in the driveway. And from there, we were able to locate and eventually interview the owner of that red pickup.
Ultimately, police arrived at LeBaron's door, and they have questions for him.
At this point, he's the one that ultimately gets to decide what role he wants to play in this investigation. In these investigations, typically when you have multiple defendants, whether it's a bank robbery with 4 or 5 defendants or a homicide with 3 or 4 defendants, typically the first person that comes to the table to talk to the prosecutors will get the best outcome.
And he spills it all. It ends up being a very wild night and a wild scene.
Detroit police are questioning 44-year-old LeBaron Borum, one of 2 suspects identified at the scene of Jonte Brooks' murder. According to LeBaron, he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time.
He says he was strictly trying to be a good Samaritan, and he just got caught up in a very bad situation.
LeBaron says it began with an argument between two strangers on his front lawn.
LeBaron tells the officers his son ran into the house and told him, "Dad, there's a van that ran up onto our yard." At this point, LeBaron went outside to see what was going on.
What he says is that he notices there's a female and a male, they're arguing, there's some type of altercation going on. Ultimately, he says the male gets into the vehicle, and it appears that he's about to run the female over. She ultimately gets out of the way, and he drives on in this white van.
LeBaron tells the officers he does recognize the lady from the neighborhood. It is 27-year-old Minnietta Yeager.
He knew the man arguing with Minnietta as well. It was her ex-boyfriend, Jonte Brooks.
What he stated was that he was aware that Miss Yeager and Mr. Brooks were in a tumultuous type of relationship.
By the time LeBaron came to her aid, Jonte had already driven away.
He went to help Miss Yeager, thinking that this was a woman in distress. And she ultimately says, "Hey, yes, can you go after this white van? That's my mother's van. I gotta get it back. I'm concerned my boyfriend just attacked me and he took the van." He had no clue that she had a gun on her. So he ultimately lets Miss Yeager into his vehicle, and they drive off looking for this white minivan.
While they were chasing Jonte, Minnietta called police to report the van stolen. Then she called Jonte.
Miss Yeager said her plan was to try to keep Jonte on the phone as long as possible so the police can get to him and he could be arrested.
There's some heated words being said back and forth. Ultimately, he also hears that they agreed to meet up on the east side of Detroit at a gas station in the area of Van Dyke and Warren Avenue. And this would have been around 1 o'clock in the morning on August 27th. When they get to the gas station, there's no Jonte. And so, she instantly calls Jonte on her phone. She argues with him, "Why didn't you show up?" Well, apparently he did show up because he says that he noticed that she was in a vehicle with another man. He's not too happy about that, according to her, and he has choice words. She indicates to LeBaron that he ultimately makes a threat towards her, saying he's gonna kill them.
At this point, LeBaron was reconsidering his decision to get involved. But he ultimately agreed to drive to another gas station.
LeBaron tells the officers Jonte pulled up about a minute later. But then they started arguing because he was highly upset.
He says something to apparently push her buttons. She immediately gets out the vehicle and pulls out a weapon. And she starts to fire into the vehicle that Jonte is in.
Mr. Brooks, without hesitation, just hit the gas and took off. In the course of the shots being fired at the vehicle, Mr. Brooks was shot.
But the harrowing encounter wasn't over yet.
At this point, LeBaron is terrified. He didn't know what just happened. He wanted to just get out of there. However, Ms. Yeager jumped back into the vehicle and told him to just drive.
As Jonte is attempting to get away, he's obviously shot and he's obviously hurt because he then pulls into the lot of a church which is nearby on Mack Avenue, and at that point collapses. LeBaron seeing this and Miss Yeager seeing this as they're chasing him, they then decide to pull off and keep going. What LeBaron indicates to the police is that he noticed some lights behind him and, he freaks out.
He saw the police coming and he did not want to be a part of that at all.
He decides to turn down a side street. He ultimately makes his way back home. And strangely enough, he says that Miss Yeager just gets out the vehicle and walks back home. Doesn't say a single word. And from that point, he says he doesn't hear from her ever again. In fact, he doesn't hear anything else until police arrive at his door.
Investigators believe LeBaron is telling the truth. Unfortunately, his actions still make him an accessory to murder.
I don't know if Miss Yeager was intentionally trying to kill Mr. Brooks, but her reckless display of firing a weapon and her disregard for life or anything, the outcome was ultimately homicide. So here we are.
He is ultimately charged as an accessory after the fact. And police charged him because he helped her flee the scene. And then he doesn't immediately go to police.
Hours after the murder of Detroit native Jonte Brooks, investigators are searching for the woman accused of shooting him. Jonte's ex-girlfriend, Mignetta Yeager. They also reach out to Jonte's loved ones to notify them of his death.
That Sunday morning when I woke up, I'm in Vegas. I woke up, I looked at my phone. My phone is flooded with missed texts and messages. So I listened to one of my voicemails. It was my youngest son. And he said, "Ma," he was crying. He said, "Ma, I can't believe this. This girl killed your son." I called home. I said, "What is going on?" My youngest son said, "Ma, I just got back from the hospital. I had to view him. He said she killed your son." I just lost it. I lost it.
After recovering from the initial shock, Jonte's family tells police they feared something like this might eventually happen.
What we had learned through the investigation was it was a tumultuous relationship.
So while things started out great in the beginning for Jonte, the transition happened when things got a little more hostile in the relationship. So Miss Yeager started calling him a lot, stalking him, accusing him of being with other women, popping up unannounced at his family's house.
I always heard her in my home, but I never cared to meet her or anything because she was loud, Every time she came to my house, she was always loud. And I just told him that, she can't come over no more because she's very disrespectful. And he said, okay.
When partners start showing that behavior of calling him a lot, accusing him of being with other women, at first we take that as a sign of, they like me, they're crazy about me. That behavior tends to get ignored a lot until it's very problematic, right? But at that point, it's a pattern and you find yourself stuck in a relationship, right? That's unhealthy.
I know there was a lot of 911 calls back and forth for the domestic situations between her and him. So there was definitely, from a long-term perspective, there was a buildup.
Jonte's loved ones became even more concerned when they discovered Mignetta's family had a history of violence.
Unfortunately, Mignetta was no stranger to this type of violence. Her sister years prior had murdered her ex-boyfriend and his current girlfriend.
I told my son, I said, "Jonte, Mignetta is dangerous. Stay away." He was young. He said, "Okay, I know, Mom, I know." But he didn't.
In August 2017, 2 weeks before Jonte's murder, the family says he and Mignetta got into a heated argument.
Miss Yeager was very erratic and emotional at this time. Jonte's mother showed the police officers her Ring camera. And it shows Mrs. Yeager standing outside her house, banging on the door, yelling for Jonte to come out. He refuses to come out. However, finally, he does come to the door.
They got into it. She bust out all my windows in my front of my house. And then she also bust out the window in my car.
But despite Minyetta's alleged violent outburst, Jonte refused to get police involved.
In a case where you have the male that's the victim, what we oftentimes see is that they don't go to authorities for numerous reasons. One is they're not believed. Those type of cases, unfortunately, aren't taken seriously. And also, it's that male stigma, right? You want to be tough and to go to police or to go to friends or loved ones and say, hey, I'm being abused by this female. Well, takes a little way away from your masculinity. So men feel a little ashamed. You rather walk away. And that's what Jonte was doing here.
Crazy. Crazy.
Instead, he finally decided to break up with her.
August 27th, that's the day he got killed. But that Friday before, I talked to him and he was like, Mom, I see what everybody is saying. I gotta get away from this girl. I say, Jonte, I agree. He said, I got to get away.
When you're in a relationship that is hostile and volatile and unpredictable and unsafe, you do reach a breaking point and you don't want to hear from that person anymore. You cut them off completely, and a lot of times that is not well received.
The night before he died, Jonte agreed to meet up with Minyetta one last time.
What we know is that on August 26th, Jonte is contacted by Miss Yeager, and she's insistent. She wants to meet with him. She wants to talk. He's trying to tell her, no, it's over. I'm moving on. There's nothing else, I need to talk about. And she wants to meet him at his aunt's house, which is not far from where she lives.
Minyetta was always bribing him with money and gifts. Even if he says no, she will still come around. If he don't react the way that she want him to react, she will sit in the driveway and just blow on the horn, just lay on the horn. So this particular night, she did this. Jonte didn't want no problems, because this was my sister's house. And she was beating on the door at first. My sister came to the door and told her that Jonte is asleep. So she go back to the car and just lays on the horn at my sister's home. Jonte came outside and, he went with her.
Just a few hours later, Jonte was dead. And now, investigators can't find Minyetta anywhere.
They've been cabin sitting in the neighborhood. They put a bolo out. At this point, they even go to the news media because they cannot find her anywhere.
This is on the 11 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news, and ultimately someone does see and does give information. It's her, it's Miss Yeager herself.
Less than 24 hours after fatally shooting her ex-boyfriend, Jonte Brooks, Minyetta Yeager turns herself in to Detroit police.
She was transported to our holding facility, which is the Detroit Detention Center, and I went and interviewed her there. But I believe that she had an opportunity to speak with a lawyer before she turned herself in, so our interview was very short.
The story Minyetta tells police is quite different from the one they've heard so far. Minyetta claims she's the one who ended the relationship with Jonte, not the other way around.
She says she was abused by Jonte for months now. And at this point, she went to the mother's house because she finally had the courage to break up with him. She says that once she told him that she wanted to break up, he went crazy.
According to Minyetta, Jonte is the abuser in the relationship. And on this night, she says that he pulled her out of the van, beat her up, even beat her with a pistol at one point.
She finally was able to get away and run away from him. But no, he took the van and tried to run her over. At this point, LeBaron was there and she saw him and he offered to help.
Mignetta says she asked LeBaron to drive her to the gas station, intending to get her van back from Jante. As she got out of LeBaron's truck, he handed her a gun to protect herself.
She says, in fact, that it was LeBaron who had the weapon and that she was simply there to just talk to Jante. But she takes the weapon. She's in fear. She's in natural fear. She doesn't know what Jante's gonna do. She says ultimately, out of self-defense, she shoots at Jante. That she probably shot once or twice, 2 or 3 times at most. But then she tells police that her memory is foggy about the exact details.
Investigators are skeptical of her claims.
But it didn't make much sense because, she says that she was abused and he was the abuser, but yet she's pursuing him. There's evidence that shows that she's appeared at his mother's house on a couple of occasions and, threw a brick through the mother's windshield, tried to attack him when he opened the door to have a conversation. She says she shot 2 or 3 times at most, but we know from the physical evidence that there were 17 shell casings there at the gas station.
The police had a tough job in this situation because on one hand, we have Mignetta, who is reporting abuse, and then on the other hand, they also have contradicting reports where she was the abuser.
In a situation of domestic violence, you'll see signs of abuse. You'll see black eyes, you'll see broken noses, you'll see fat lips and cuts and scars and things of that nature. But in this situation, I don't remember any type of injuries to her. Now, there was a day or 2 that had passed, so if something healed, I'm sure there's probably some doctors that could argue one way. There's some doctors that could probably argue the other. However, in this situation, I didn't see anything obvious.
I think that people in general expect a bad woman to act and look a certain way, that this person is going to be meek and timid and scared and crying. And in my experience, you don't know how you're going to act. People do act different ways, so we have to investigate.
Mignetta's statement also raises another question.
Miss Yeager said LeBaron gave her a gun, but LeBaron said Miss Yeager just brandished the gun. So where did the gun come from?
It's a very important detail because if LeBaron, in fact, did hand her this weapon, well, maybe this is not a first-degree murder case. Maybe this is a second-degree murder case or manslaughter.
When investigators re-interview LeBaron Borum, he says Mignetta is lying.
LeBaron says he doesn't own a gun, does not have one registered to him or anything. The police even search his home and do not find one.
But Mignetta doesn't appear to have the gun either.
In murder cases, oftentimes the defendant, especially when they've had time to flee the scene and head home, they'll discard the weapon, they'll throw it somewhere, they'll hide it someplace, they might pass it on to someone else. Police did search for the weapon but couldn't find it, which is not unusual. But they have enough evidence.
There's a misconception that you need a firearm to prove a homicide occurred or to charge somebody with homicide. That's not true.
The video evidence is pretty damning in and of itself.
On August 30th, 2017, Mignetta Yeager is charged with first-degree murder. At her arraignment, she shows little remorse.
It was like around her birthday, and she told the judge, well, can we get this on? I want to get out of here. And the judge say, Miss Mignetta, this is a homicide right here. You're not getting out that fast.
On September 6, 2017, family and friends of Jonte Brooks gathered to pay their last respects.
He had a big funeral. Um, we kept the casket open. I didn't want them to close it on him, you know. And it was sad, but after the funeral we had the dove release. And the doves just didn't go nowhere. They're supposed to fly away, but they didn't go nowhere. And everybody was saying that's him, this dove. But he had a nice funeral.
Nearly a year later, in August 2018, his accused killer, Minetta Yeager, goes on trial.
Ms. Yeager's crux of her defense was that she was the one being abused. She was the only person who could testify to that, so she had to take the stand if that's what she wanted to do. And she wanted to do that, so she took the stand, and it didn't work out very well. Ms. Yeager indicated there were a couple people that tried to help her when he was assaulting her just previous to this homicide. That didn't bear out. These people, they were never found. There were no visible injuries.
Minetta is a liar. She was saying that he was beating on her. If he was beating on you, why all the time you're at my house? Why I have to always ask my son to keep you away? We couldn't keep you away.
Prosecutors focus on the night of the shooting, arguing the evidence clearly shows Minetta was the aggressor.
Video evidence was very specific to show that Miss Yeager went to that gas station with one intention, and one intention only, and that was to seek revenge to Mr. Brooks for taking her vehicle. She didn't get out of the car and flag him down and stop him and say, let's talk, reach her hand out for the exchange of keys. Wheels were still rolling, and she was already out of the neighbor's vehicle and firing at Mr. Brooks. In domestic violence situations and tumultuous relationships, it's not about love anymore. It's about property, what's mine. And I think people ultimately become property to each other as well. You belong to me.
In previous situations, Jonte had kind of acquiesced. This time he was staying true to what he wanted, and he drove off from her, and she did not know how to respond to that, and that led her into a rage.
After a 3-day trial, the jury finds Minetta Yeager guilty as charged.
We were able to have Ms. Yeager convicted of first-degree murder, and that is mandatory life in prison in the state of Michigan.
And the judge asked her, did she have anything to say to me or the family? She said no. She was looking directly at Dwayna and really smiling, which is evil, pure evil.
LeBaron Borum is also convicted of being an accessory after the fact. He serves less than 2 years in prison.
Whenever you get a guilty verdict on any case, but especially on a homicide, there's a sense of a job well done, that all of your hard work is paid off, and you're especially glad to get that justice for the family. But there's always going to be that sense of loss, and you can never make that family whole.
Everybody tells me that I have to forgive her. I would never forgive her. Never forgive her. This is my firstborn. She took him away from me, but I don't have anything to say to her. People say hate is a strong word. I want to go above hate. I hate her, and God understands my pain. I don't have to forgive her.
On the afternoon of July 9th, 1996, the English countryside looked exactly as it had for generations. The narrow lanes of rural Kent stretched between green hedgerows and golden summer fields, untouched by the urgency of city life. Small villages rested quietly beneath a pale blue sky. Church towers stood above clusters of brick cottages, and the roads that connected them were so peaceful that they often carried more cyclists and walkers than cars. It was the kind of landscape that appeared on postcards, the kind of place where parents believed their children could still grow up surrounded by safety instead of fear. Nothing in the stillness of that July afternoon suggested that before the day was over, one of Britain's most haunting murder investigations would begin. In villages like Chillenden, people measured time differently. Neighbors recognized each other's footsteps. A passing car was noticed. Children walked familiar paths without attracting concern, and strangers rarely escaped attention. It was a community built on routine, where ordinary days blended together until they became memories almost impossible to separate from one another. That ordinary rhythm made what happened on July 9th feel almost unimaginable. Violence on such a scale belonged somewhere else. It belonged in newspaper headlines from distant cities, not on a quiet footpath hidden behind trees and hedgerows. When investigators would later retrace every movement from that afternoon, they found themselves reconstructing what had begun as an entirely ordinary family journey. There was no evidence that anyone involved expected danger. There were no reports of arguments, no signs that the family believed they were being followed, and no indication that the hours ahead would alter countless lives forever. What began as a walk home became one of the darkest chapters in modern British criminal history. As daylight slowly drifted toward evening, concern began to grow among those expecting the Russell family to return. Time passed quietly at first. Delays happen. Children become distracted. Summer afternoons often stretch longer than planned. But with every passing minute, reassurance slowly gave way to uncertainty. The familiar comfort of routine began to disappear, replaced by questions that no one yet knew how to answer. Long before the public learned the names Lynn Russell, Megan Russell, and Josie Russell, police officers were already confronting a scene that experienced investigators would later describe as deeply distressing. Hidden beside a rural pathway lay evidence of extraordinary violence. A mother had been killed. Her young daughter had also lost her life. Another child, gravely injured, had somehow survived. Even the family's dog had not been spared. For detectives arriving at the scene, the first challenge was not identifying a suspect. It was understanding how something so brutal could occur in a place defined by peace. Every branch, every footprint, every discarded object suddenly carried significance. The countryside that had seemed so welcoming only hours earlier now concealed unanswered questions. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a person responsible for unimaginable violence had disappeared without leaving investigators an obvious path toward the truth. As news spread across Kent, disbelief quickly became the dominant emotion. Residents struggled to reconcile the image of their quiet community with reports emerging from police cordons and television broadcasts. Parents who had long encouraged their children to explore the countryside independently suddenly reconsidered routines they had never questioned. Doors that had rarely been locked during daylight hours began closing earlier. Familiar walking routes no longer felt entirely safe. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. A single afternoon had quietly rewritten the community's understanding of security. The murders soon became national news. Newspapers described the extraordinary scale of the investigation that followed, while television crews descended upon roads that most viewers had never heard of before. Reporters searched for explanations that did not yet exist. Detectives appealed for witnesses. The public wanted answers almost immediately, but the evidence refused to produce simple conclusions. The investigation expanded rapidly into one of the largest murder inquiries undertaken by Kent police. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Hundreds of potential leads were examined. Individuals from different backgrounds came under scrutiny. Every possible connection seemed worthy of investigation because investigators understood that overlooking even the smallest detail might allow a killer to escape justice. Yet despite the enormous commitment of resources, certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. As months passed, public attention shifted from shock to expectation. Someone had to be responsible. Families demanded justice. Journalists analyzed every development. Rumors spread through local communities faster than verified information. The pressure on investigators grew steadily heavier, and with that pressure came difficult decisions about which evidence deserved greater weight and which theories should be discarded. Eventually, attention focused on a man named Michael Stone. His criminal history, struggles with addiction, and reputation placed him under intense scrutiny. Prosecutors argued that the evidence pointed toward his guilt. He would later be convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. For many observers, that verdict appeared to close the case. Another notorious murderer had been identified, prosecuted, and removed from society. Yet this story refused to end there. Unlike many criminal investigations that conclude with a conviction, the Russell murders continued to generate serious legal and public debate for decades. Appeals followed. Questions emerged about witness testimony. Critics highlighted the absence of DNA evidence directly linking Stone to the crime scene. Others argued that key prosecution evidence depended too heavily on disputed accounts rather than conclusive forensic proof. What initially appeared to be a solved case gradually transformed into one of Britain's most controversial criminal convictions. Years became decades. Advances in forensic science created opportunities to revisit evidence that had once been considered exhausted. Lawyers, journalists, investigators, and independent researchers continued examining the case from different perspectives. Each new development seemed to answer one question while raising another. Every review reminded the public that criminal justice is not measured solely by convictions but also by confidence in how those convictions are reached. The uncertainty surrounding the case deepened further as alternative theories occasionally resurfaced. Various names entered public discussion over the years, including individuals whose alleged involvement attracted considerable media attention. Some claims proved unreliable. Others failed to satisfy investigators. None fundamentally altered the legal status of the conviction, yet together they reinforced a persistent question that refused to disappear: had the right person truly been convicted? By 2026, the case entered another significant chapter. The Criminal Cases Review Commission continued examining aspects of the conviction while modern DNA testing techniques offered possibilities unavailable during the original investigation. Reports also emerged concerning information pointing toward another potential suspect who had died years earlier. Kent police confirmed their cooperation with the ongoing review while maintaining that Michael Stone's conviction remained legally valid unless overturned through the courts. Rather than bringing closure, these developments reminded the public that some criminal cases continue evolving long after courtroom verdicts have been delivered. That unresolved tension is what separates the Russell murders from many other notorious investigations. This is not simply the story of an appalling act of violence committed on a summer afternoon. It is also the story of a justice system placed under extraordinary pressure, of evidence examined and re-examined across decades, and of a question that continues to divide legal experts, investigators, journalists, and members of the public alike. At the heart of the case remain the people whose lives were forever changed on that July afternoon. Behind every headline, every appeal, every forensic review, and every courtroom argument stands the irreversible loss suffered by one family. No legal debate can erase that reality. No controversy surrounding the conviction changes the devastating consequences of the attack itself. The search for certainty has become part of the history of this case, but the tragedy that began it has never changed. This documentary is not an attempt to sensationalize violence or to present speculation as fact. Instead, it follows the known evidence, distinguishes established findings from disputed claims, and explores how one seemingly ordinary afternoon in rural England became the beginning of one of the most debated murder cases in modern British history. Some questions have answers supported by court records and investigative findings. Others remain unresolved despite decades of examination. Together, they form a case that continues to challenge assumptions about evidence, memory, justice, and the limits of certainty itself. Before examining the investigation, however, it is necessary to return to the beginning, to the peaceful landscape of rural Kent, the lives of the Russell family, and the ordinary routines that made the events of July 9, 1996, so profoundly difficult to comprehend. On the evening of July 9, 1996, investigators faced two realities at the same time. The first was undeniable. An act of extraordinary violence had taken place in the quiet countryside near the village of Chillenden in Kent. The second was far less certain. They did not yet know who was responsible, whether the attack had been planned or opportunistic, or why one family had become the target. Those unanswered questions would shape an investigation that continued to evolve for decades. In the hours following the discovery, officers from Kent Police secured the area and began documenting the scene with meticulous care. Every visible item was photographed, measured, and recorded. The isolated location presented both advantages and difficulties. Because the footpath was not heavily traveled, there was hope that any physical evidence left behind might belong to the offender. At the same time, the natural environment posed challenges. Vegetation, weather, and the passage of time could all affect fragile traces that might later prove significant. From the beginning, investigators treated the case as one of the most serious criminal inquiries in the county's history. Additional detectives, forensic specialists, and support personnel were assigned. Appeals for information were issued to the public, encouraging anyone who had been in the area that afternoon to come forward, no matter how insignificant their observation might seem. A passing vehicle, an unfamiliar face, or an unusual sound could potentially become an important piece of the investigation. As information reached national news organizations, public attention intensified. The combination of an apparently random attack, young victims, and the rural setting made the case unlike many violent crimes that dominated headlines during the period. Communities across Britain followed developments closely, while residents of Kent struggled to reconcile the familiar landscape around them with the knowledge that such violence had occurred there. Detectives gradually reconstructed the Russell family's movements on July 9 using witness statements, available records, and physical evidence. This reconstruction established a timeline that became central to the investigation. Understanding where the family had been, who might have seen them, and how much time had elapsed before the attack was essential in narrowing possible investigative leads. While portions of that timeline became well established, many critical questions remained unanswered, including whether the attacker had selected the family in advance or encountered them by chance. The investigation expanded rapidly. According to official accounts, more than 9,000 individuals were interviewed over the course of the inquiry, and investigators collected well over 1,000 witness statements. Such numbers reflected both the scale of the investigation and the determination to examine every credible lead. Many potential suspects were identified during this process, but eliminating possibilities proved just as important as identifying them. Forensic evidence was examined using the scientific techniques available during the late 1990s. Although investigators recovered physical material from the scene, no DNA profile directly linked a suspect to the attack. This absence of conclusive forensic evidence would later become one of the central issues discussed throughout the legal proceedings and subsequent appeals. Public interest remained intense as the investigation progressed. Newspapers published regular updates, often reporting new theories or possible breakthroughs before investigators had reached firm conclusions. As with many high-profile criminal cases, speculation sometimes moved faster than verified facts. Police repeatedly emphasized the importance of distinguishing confirmed evidence from rumor, particularly because inaccurate information could complicate an active investigation. Attention eventually focused on Michael Stone, a man whose previous criminal history and personal circumstances attracted significant scrutiny. Following his arrest in 1997, prosecutors assembled a case that relied on multiple forms of evidence, including testimony from witnesses and information presented during the investigation. In 1998, Stone was convicted of the murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, the conviction did not end public discussion. Legal challenges followed, and the case entered a new phase in which the reliability of certain evidence became a subject of sustained examination. In 2001, Stone's original conviction was quashed because of concerns regarding aspects of the evidence presented during the first trial. A retrial was ordered, and later that same year he was convicted again. The second conviction remains legally in force. Even after the retrial, debate continued among legal commentators, journalists, and others who examined the case. Some argued that the totality of the evidence supported the verdict reached by the jury. Others questioned whether the absence of direct forensic evidence, together with disputes surrounding certain witness testimony, left unresolved issues deserving further review. These differing interpretations have remained part of public discussion for many years. Advances in forensic science have added another dimension to that discussion. As DNA analysis became increasingly sophisticated, some experts suggested that evidence collected during the original investigation might benefit from renewed examination using technologies unavailable at the time. Such developments have contributed to periodic reviews of the case without altering the legal status of the conviction. The case received renewed attention in 2026 when the Criminal Cases Review Commission confirmed that aspects of the conviction remained under review. Reports also emerged identifying Raymond Buck as another individual whose name had been raised during more recent inquiries. Buck had died in 2000, and the information relating to him became part of a broader reassessment rather than a definitive conclusion. Kent police stated that they were cooperating with the review while noting that Michael Stone's conviction remained valid unless overturned through the judicial process. These developments illustrate why the Russell case continues to occupy a distinctive place in British criminal justice. It is simultaneously a murder investigation, a legal case, and an ongoing discussion about the evaluation of evidence. The confirmed facts surrounding the attack are devastating in their own right. At the same time, questions surrounding aspects of the investigation and prosecution have ensured that the case remains the subject of continuing scrutiny. As this documentary moves forward, it will distinguish carefully between what is established by investigative findings and court records, what was argued by prosecutors and the defense, and what remains unresolved despite decades of examination. That distinction is essential, not only because accuracy matters, but because the events of July 1996 continue to affect surviving family members, investigators, and everyone who has sought to understand what happened on that quiet country path in Kent. The search for answers has lasted far longer than anyone could have anticipated on the day the investigation began, and it remains one of the most closely examined criminal cases in modern British history. By the summer of 1996, Kent was widely known as the Garden of England. Located in the southeastern corner of the country, the county was characterized by rolling farmland, orchards, historic villages, and winding country lanes that had changed little over generations. For many families, it represented a quieter alternative to urban life, where children could grow up surrounded by open countryside and close-knit communities. The landscape itself shaped everyday routines. Walking between villages, cycling along rural roads, and spending afternoons outdoors were ordinary parts of life rather than unusual activities. The village of Chillenden reflected many of those characteristics. It was a small rural community where residents were accustomed to recognizing familiar faces. Local roads carried relatively little traffic, and footpaths connected homes, fields, and neighboring villages. Although residents understood that no place was completely free from crime, serious acts of violence were uncommon enough that they rarely influenced daily behavior. Many people regarded the area as one where ordinary precautions were sufficient and where the pace of life encouraged a sense of familiarity rather than suspicion. The Russell family shared that everyday routine. On July 9, 1996, Lynn Russell and her daughters had attended a swimming gala before beginning the journey home on foot. Nothing publicly documented about their movements that day suggested they believed they were in danger. Investigators later reconstructed much of the family's route through witness accounts and other evidence gathered during the investigation, but no evidence established that they expected to encounter the individual responsible for the attack. The route home passed through quiet stretches of countryside where hedgerows bordered narrow paths and fields extended beyond the line of sight. Such routes were familiar to local residents and were commonly used by walkers. During daylight hours in summer, they would not ordinarily have been considered unusual or especially dangerous. This ordinary setting later became one of the defining features of the case. The contrast between the peaceful environment and the extreme violence of the attack profoundly influenced public reaction throughout the United Kingdom. News coverage frequently emphasized this contrast. Reports described not only the seriousness of the crime but also the location in which it occurred. For many readers and viewers, the setting challenged assumptions about where violent crime was most likely to occur. Rather than taking place in a crowded urban environment or during the commission of another offense, the attack happened in broad daylight along a rural path that many people would have regarded as safe. The investigation therefore extended beyond identifying a suspect. Detectives also attempted to understand the circumstances that allowed the attack to occur without immediate intervention. They examined the family's movements, estimated the timing of events, and appealed to anyone who might have traveled through the surrounding area that afternoon. Even observations that appeared insignificant were considered potentially valuable because investigators sought to reconstruct the environment as accurately as possible. The wider social context of the mid-1990s also shaped public discussion. Advances in forensic science were beginning to transform criminal investigations, particularly through the growing use of DNA analysis. At the same time, many expectations about forensic evidence exceeded what technology could reliably provide. Public confidence in scientific techniques was increasing, yet investigators still faced practical limitations in collecting, preserving, and interpreting evidence. Those limitations would later become relevant as legal challenges questioned whether additional testing, unavailable during the original investigation, might produce new information. As media attention intensified, the village itself experienced dramatic changes. Journalists arrived from across Britain, television crews established temporary positions near the area, and national newspapers reported developments almost daily during key stages of the investigation. Residents who had chosen village life partly for its privacy suddenly found themselves living at the center of one of the country's most closely watched criminal inquiries. For many members of the community, that attention continued long after the initial investigation had concluded. Over the years, Chillenden became associated not only with the tragic events of July 1996 but also with the broader questions that emerged during subsequent legal proceedings. The location acquired a place in discussions about criminal investigation, forensic evidence, and the challenges of achieving confidence in complex cases. Although the physical landscape changed relatively little, public memory of the village became inseparable from the events that unfolded there. Understanding this setting is essential before examining the lives of those directly affected. The significance of the Russell case lies not only in the violence of the attack or the controversy surrounding the conviction but also in the fact that it interrupted what appeared to be an entirely ordinary day in a community where such an event seemed almost unimaginable. That contrast between normality and tragedy continues to shape how the case is remembered and why it remains the subject of continuing legal and historical interest. Before the case became known through court proceedings, appeals, and years of legal debate, it was first and foremost a family tragedy. Public attention would eventually focus on evidence, suspects, and competing interpretations of the investigation. Yet at the center of every development were three people whose ordinary lives were permanently changed on a single summer afternoon. Lynn Russell was a 45-year-old mother living with her family in Kent. Friends and neighbors described the Russell family as leading an ordinary life, one centered on work, school, and the everyday routines familiar to many households. Like countless parents, Lynn spent much of her time supporting her children's activities and maintaining the structure of family life. Publicly available information about the family has remained intentionally limited over the years, reflecting efforts to respect the privacy of surviving relatives. As a result, many personal details that often appear in media profiles have never been confirmed and should not be inferred. On the 9th of July, 1996, Lynn was accompanied by her daughters, 9-year-old Josie and 6-year-old Megan, after attending a swimming gala. The outing itself was unremarkable. Swimming competitions were a regular part of childhood for many families, and nothing documented by investigators suggested that the day had begun differently from countless others. Their route home followed familiar paths through the Kent countryside, a journey that, by all available accounts, appeared routine. In later years, public memory understandably came to distinguish between the three family members because of the different outcomes of the attack. Lynn Russell and 6-year-old Megan Russell lost their lives. Josie Russell survived despite sustaining life-threatening injuries. Her survival became one of the most significant aspects of the investigation, both because she endured the attack and because her recovery represented an extraordinary medical achievement. Throughout the years that followed, however, public reporting has generally respected her privacy, and responsible accounts have avoided unnecessary speculation about her personal life beyond the facts relevant to the case. Remembering the victims in this way is important because criminal cases can gradually become dominated by discussions of forensic evidence, legal arguments, and disputed convictions. Those issues remain significant, particularly in a case that continues to attract legal scrutiny decades later. Even so, they should not overshadow the fact that the investigation began with the loss experienced by a single family, not with a courtroom debate. Every subsequent development, from the police inquiry to appeals and renewed forensic reviews, exists because of what occurred on that summer afternoon in rural Kent. Before investigators reconstructed timelines, before courtrooms weighed evidence, and before the case became the subject of decades of legal debate, the events of the 9th of July, 1996 were, above all else, a tragedy that affected one family. The names most frequently associated with the investigation, Lynn Russell, Megan Russell, and Josie Russell, appeared repeatedly in police statements, court records, and news reports. Yet behind those records were individuals whose lives were defined not by the circumstances of the crime but by ordinary routines shared by countless families across England. Publicly available information about the Russell family has remained relatively limited, in part because of efforts to protect the privacy of surviving relatives. Unlike some high-profile criminal cases in which extensive personal histories become widely reported, much of the family's private life has appropriately remained outside the public record. As a result, responsible accounts distinguish between facts established through official sources and assumptions that cannot be supported by evidence. Lynn Russell was 45 years old at the time of the attack. She was a mother raising her children in Kent, balancing the responsibilities familiar to many parents, supporting school activities, organizing family routines, and participating in the everyday commitments that shape family life. Contemporary reporting described the family as living an ordinary life within their local community. Nothing publicly documented about their background suggested that they were connected to criminal activity or involved in circumstances that would have anticipated the events of that July afternoon. Her daughters were at different stages of childhood. Josie Russell, aged 9, and Megan Russell, aged 6, shared interests typical of children their age, including swimming. On the 9th of July, 1996, they had attended a swimming gala before beginning the journey home. Investigators later established that this outing formed part of the family's normal routine. There is no verified evidence indicating that the family believed they were being followed or expected any danger during their return home. The significance of that ordinary routine became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Many violent crimes are understood through identifiable motives such as financial gain, personal conflict, or prior relationships between victims and offenders. In contrast, investigators spent considerable effort attempting to determine whether the Russell family had been specifically targeted or whether they had encountered the attacker by chance. That question has remained an important aspect of the investigation and subsequent discussion of the case. The attack had devastating consequences. Lynn Russell and 6-year-old Megan Russell died from the injuries they sustained. Josie Russell survived despite suffering severe head injuries. Her survival represented an extraordinary medical outcome and later became one of the most remarkable aspects of the case. Because she was a child at the time and remains a private individual, public reporting has generally avoided unnecessary discussion of her personal life beyond information directly relevant to the investigation and legal proceedings. Remembering the victims separately from the legal controversy is essential to understanding the historical significance of the Russell case. Over time, public attention has often focused on the investigation, the prosecution of Michael Stone, subsequent appeals, and continuing debate over forensic evidence. Those issues are important and remain the subject of legal and academic discussion. However, they should not obscure the central reality that prompted every stage of the investigation, the loss experienced by one family and the lasting consequences of the violence committed on the 9th of July, 1996. As this documentary continues, the focus will shift from the lives of the Russell family to the sequence of events that investigators were able to establish through witness testimony, forensic examination, and official records. Where evidence provides clear answers, those findings will be presented as such. Where uncertainty remains, the distinction between established fact and continuing debate will be made explicit. That approach reflects both the ongoing legal significance of the case and the responsibility to present its history accurately. Although the Russell case is often remembered through the lens of the criminal investigation, it is important to recognize how easily the identities of victims can become overshadowed by years of legal proceedings. Court hearings, appeals, forensic reviews, and media coverage inevitably focused on suspects and evidence. Yet those developments occurred only because an ordinary family experienced an irreversible loss on an otherwise routine summer day. Public records indicate that the family had participated in a swimming gala before beginning their journey home. Such events were common parts of community life, bringing together children, parents, and local organizations. Nothing in the available evidence suggests that the outing itself was unusual or that anyone present identified circumstances that would later become significant to the investigation. When investigators reconstructed the family's movements, they relied on witness statements, timing estimates, and physical evidence collected during the inquiry. This reconstruction established where the family had been and approximately when they traveled through the countryside. While these findings became essential to understanding the sequence of events, they also underscored how ordinary the day had appeared before the attack. The family's activities reflected routine daily life rather than exceptional circumstances. The impact of the attack extended beyond the immediate loss of life. For relatives, friends, first responders, investigators, and members of the local community, the events of the 9th of July, 1996 became a lasting point of reference. Communities affected by major crimes often experience changes that are difficult to measure statistically but are nevertheless significant. Everyday habits may change, perceptions of safety may shift, and places previously associated with ordinary routines may acquire entirely different meanings. In the Russell case, that broader impact became evident through public discussion in Kent and across the United Kingdom. Media attention focused on the investigation, but local communities also reflected on the vulnerability revealed by the crime. A route that had been regarded as an ordinary path through the countryside became permanently associated with one of the country's most closely examined murder investigations. Such changes illustrate how serious acts of violence can alter collective memory as much as individual experience. The surviving member of the immediate family, Josie Russell, later recovered from injuries that had initially threatened her life. Medical professionals involved in her treatment achieved an outcome that was widely recognized as remarkable given the severity of those injuries. Over subsequent decades, however, public reporting has generally respected her privacy. Responsible accounts have avoided unnecessary attention to her personal life, acknowledging that surviving victims retain the right to live beyond the public identity created by a criminal case. This distinction is particularly important in historical documentaries. While legal proceedings and investigative developments remain matters of public record, the personal lives of victims and survivors deserve careful treatment. The available evidence provides insight into the investigation itself, but it does not justify speculation regarding experiences or emotions that were never documented. Presenting the case accurately therefore requires acknowledging both what is known and what remains appropriately private. As attention increasingly shifted toward identifying the offender, the Russell family gradually became known to many members of the public primarily through legal documents and news coverage. Nevertheless, the investigation always retained its original purpose, determining responsibility for the deaths of Lynn Russell and Megan Russell and for the attack on Josie Russell. Every forensic examination, witness interview, and courtroom proceeding ultimately traced back to that objective. Understanding the victims within this factual context provides an essential foundation for examining the investigation that followed. The evidence collected after the attack, the theories considered by detectives, and the legal debates that continue today all emerged from a single event that interrupted an ordinary family's daily routine. Recognizing that reality helps place subsequent developments within their proper perspective and underscores why the case continues to receive careful examination decades after it first entered the public record. The years following the attack placed the Russell family at the center of a story that was discussed across Britain, yet the individuals themselves were never defined by the investigation alone. A criminal case can preserve names in official records, but those records represent only a small part of a person's existence. Before July 1996, Lynn, Megan, and Josie were known primarily within their own family and community, not through headlines or courtroom proceedings. For investigators and the wider public, the challenge was to avoid reducing the victims to a sequence of events. Lynn Russell was not simply a name connected to a murder inquiry. She was a mother, a member of her community, and a person whose absence affected those around her. Megan Russell was not simply identified through her age in official documents. She was a child whose life ended before she had the opportunity to grow into adulthood. Josie Russell became known publicly because she survived the attack, but her experience also represented the long-term impact that violent crime can have on survivors. Cases involving child victims often generate a particularly strong public response because they challenge assumptions about safety and vulnerability. The Russell case was no exception. The fact that the victims were a mother and her young daughters, traveling together through a familiar environment, contributed to the widespread shock that followed. However, responsible examination of such cases requires more than focusing on the circumstances of the crime. It requires recognizing the people affected and the lives that existed before the investigation began. The public attention surrounding the case also created difficult circumstances for those connected to the family. High-profile investigations often bring intense media coverage, public speculation, and repeated discussion of deeply personal events. While such attention can assist investigations by encouraging witnesses to come forward, it can also place additional pressure on families already dealing with profound loss. Throughout the investigation and later legal proceedings, the central question remained the same: who was responsible for what happened on the 9th of July, 1996? But alongside that legal question was another equally important consideration. How should society remember those who were affected? Over time, the Russell case became associated with debates about evidence, criminal justice, and possible miscarriages of justice. Yet any examination of those issues must begin with the reality that 2 lives were lost and another was permanently changed. The continuing discussion surrounding the case demonstrates the complexity of criminal justice. A conviction may answer the legal question of responsibility, but public confidence often depends on whether the evidence and procedures leading to that conviction remain convincing over time. In the Russell case, later questions about evidence and forensic possibilities resulted in renewed attention decades after the original trials. These developments did not change the importance of remembering the victims or the impact of their loss. Modern reviews of historical cases frequently involve balancing 2 responsibilities: ensuring that justice is accurate and protecting the dignity of those affected. New forensic technologies can provide opportunities to examine old evidence, while legal reviews can reassess earlier decisions. At the same time, these processes must acknowledge that behind every file, exhibit, and courtroom argument are real people whose lives were altered forever. The Russell family story therefore remains central to understanding the case. Before examining suspects, investigations, and courtroom battles, it is necessary to remember the human foundation of the events. The tragedy was not created by a legal dispute or a media narrative. It began with the loss of a mother and daughter and the survival of another child who faced consequences that would extend far beyond the day itself. The next stage of the story moves from the victims to the events investigators attempted to reconstruct, the circumstances surrounding the attack, the discovery of the scene, and the beginning of one of the largest murder investigations in Kent's history. There, the focus shifts from who the Russell family were to the difficult task of determining what happened during the hours when their ordinary journey home became a national tragedy. On the 9th of July, 1996, the events that would later become the focus of one of Britain's most closely examined criminal investigations began with an ordinary family journey. Lynn Russell and her 2 daughters, Josie and Megan, had spent part of the day attending a swimming gala before making their way home through the countryside near Chillenden, Kent. Based on the evidence later presented during the investigation and court proceedings, there was no indication that the family expected anything unusual to happen during that journey. The route they took was typical of rural Kent. It was an environment shaped by fields, narrow roads, and pathways used by local residents. For many people living in areas like Chillenden, walking through the countryside was part of everyday life. The landscape was familiar rather than threatening. It was a place where people walked dogs, children traveled short distances, and neighbors often recognized one another. That sense of normality would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The attack did not occur in a location that immediately suggested danger. Instead, it happened in an environment that many residents associated with safety and routine. The contrast between the setting and the violence that occurred there contributed greatly to the public reaction that followed. Investigators later determined that the family encountered an unknown attacker during their journey. The exact circumstances leading up to the confrontation remained a central focus of the inquiry. Detectives examined whether the attack had been planned in advance, whether the victims were specifically targeted, or whether the meeting was the result of a chance encounter. Establishing that sequence was one of the most difficult challenges of the investigation. The evidence presented during the trials described a violent assault involving a hammer. Lynn Russell and her younger daughter, Megan, suffered fatal injuries. Josie Russell survived the attack but sustained severe injuries that required extensive medical treatment. The family's dog was also killed. Because the surviving evidence came from different sources, including forensic examination, witness information, and later legal arguments, understanding the precise details of the attack became a complicated process. Investigators had to separate confirmed findings from assumptions and determine which pieces of information could reliably explain what had occurred. For those first responding to the scene, the priority was preserving evidence and providing assistance where possible. The discovery of multiple victims transformed what initially appeared to be a local emergency into a major criminal investigation. Officers secured the area, forensic teams began examinations, and detectives started the difficult task of reconstructing events from limited information. The attack immediately raised critical questions. Why had this family been chosen? Had anyone witnessed the incident? Had the attacker left behind evidence that could identify them? Was there information from the surrounding area that could reveal movements before or after the crime? These questions would guide the investigation for months and eventually years. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the apparent lack of an obvious connection between the victims and the offender. In many investigations, detectives begin by examining relationships between victims and potential suspects. Family disputes, financial motives, workplace conflicts, or personal histories often provide an investigative direction. In the Russell case, investigators had to consider the possibility that the victims and the attacker were strangers. That possibility changed the nature of the inquiry. Instead of focusing only on people connected to the family, detectives had to examine a much wider range of possibilities. They appealed to members of the public, reviewed reports of suspicious activity, and attempted to identify anyone who may have been in the area around the time of the attack. The emotional impact of the crime was immediate. The loss of Lynn Russell and Megan Russell affected not only their relatives but also the wider community. Residents of Kent, and later people across the United Kingdom, followed developments closely. The case became a national concern because it challenged a common belief that serious violence was unlikely to occur in quiet rural surroundings. However, as the investigation progressed, the focus shifted from public shock toward the careful collection and evaluation of evidence. The initial hours and days after the attack became crucial. Every statement, every observation, and every piece of recovered material had the potential to influence the direction of the inquiry. The events of the 9th of July, 1996 created the foundation for everything that followed, one of the largest investigations undertaken by Kent Police, years of legal proceedings, and decades of debate about evidence and justice. But before investigators could begin searching for answers, they first had to understand the scene itself, the location where the attack occurred, the evidence left behind, and the first clues that might reveal the identity of the person responsible. The hours immediately following the attack marked the beginning of a process that would continue for decades, an attempt to reconstruct a sequence of events from incomplete information. For investigators, the challenge was not only discovering who was responsible, but also understanding exactly what had happened during the short period in which an ordinary family journey turned into a major criminal investigation. At the center of the inquiry was a simple but difficult question: how had a mother and her two daughters, walking through a familiar area of the Kent countryside, become victims of such violence? In the early stages of a major investigation, detectives often work backward. They begin with what is known: the location of the incident, the condition of the victims, the physical evidence recovered, and attempt to build a timeline that explains the moments before and after the crime. In the Russell case, this process involved examining the family's movements, reviewing witness information, and studying the surrounding area. The location itself became an important part of the investigation. Rural environments can appear open and exposed, yet they can also contain areas where activity is difficult to observe. Trees, hedgerows, changes in elevation, and the distance between properties can all affect visibility. For investigators, understanding the geography of the area was essential. They needed to determine who could have seen or heard something, who may have passed through nearby, and whether the attacker could have approached or left without being noticed. The fact that the attack occurred during daylight hours added another layer of complexity. Investigators had to consider the possibility that members of the public may have been nearby. They appealed for witnesses and examined any information about vehicles, pedestrians, or unusual activity in the surrounding area. Even small observations could potentially become significant when combined with other evidence. The surviving member of the family, Josie Russell, represented a crucial element of the investigation. Her survival meant that the police had information that might not otherwise have existed. However, because she had suffered severe injuries, the circumstances surrounding her recovery and any information available from her became a sensitive and complex aspect of the inquiry. Investigators had to balance the need for information with the need to consider her medical condition and well-being. The attack also created an enormous emotional challenge for everyone involved. First responders, medical staff, investigators, and members of the community were confronted with the consequences of a violent crime involving children. While professional responsibilities required them to focus on evidence and procedure, the human impact of the case remained impossible to ignore. As news of the incident spread, public reaction intensified. The crime appeared to challenge assumptions many people held about rural communities. The countryside was often associated with safety and distance from the problems of larger towns and cities. The events in Chillenden forced many people to reconsider those assumptions. The media attention surrounding the case grew quickly. Journalists sought information about the victims, the investigation, and possible suspects. Television reports and newspaper coverage brought the case into homes across Britain. While public attention helped maintain awareness and encouraged potential witnesses to come forward, it also created challenges. Investigators had to manage the flow of information carefully to protect the integrity of the inquiry. One of the most significant difficulties facing detectives was the absence of an immediately obvious suspect. There was no established relationship between the victims and a known offender. There was no clear motive identified in the early stages. Without those traditional investigative starting points, police had to cast a much wider net. The investigation therefore became an exercise in elimination. Detectives examined numerous possibilities, interviewed large numbers of people, and assessed information from a wide range of sources. Some leads appeared promising at first but later failed to provide evidence connecting an individual to the crime. Others required lengthy examination before they could be ruled out. This process highlighted a fundamental reality of criminal investigations. The first hours may reveal the seriousness of a crime, but they do not always reveal the truth behind it. Establishing responsibility requires evidence that can withstand examination, not simply a convincing theory. The Russell case would eventually lead to the arrest and conviction of Michael Stone, but that outcome was still in the future during the early stages of the investigation. At this point, detectives were faced with uncertainty. They had a devastating crime, a grieving community, and a large number of unanswered questions. The search for answers would become one of the largest investigative efforts in Kent's history. Thousands of people would be interviewed. Numerous possible leads would be examined. Years of legal proceedings would follow. Yet all of those later developments began with the same fundamental task: understanding what happened on a quiet country path on the 9th of July, 1996. The next stage of the investigation would focus on the scene itself, the physical evidence, the early forensic work, and the first attempts to identify the person responsible. In many criminal cases, the smallest details become the foundation of the entire investigation. For the officers working the Russell case, every piece of evidence had the potential to change the direction of the search for the truth. The significance of the attack on the Russell family was not only measured by the severity of the crime itself, but also by the unanswered questions that remained afterward. For investigators, the incident represented a complex puzzle in which the most important pieces were missing. They knew what had happened in its broadest sense, but understanding the full sequence of events required careful analysis of every available detail. In the days that followed, detectives worked to establish a reliable timeline. A timeline is one of the foundations of any major investigation. It helps determine who could have been present, what opportunities existed for an offender to act, and whether information provided by witnesses is consistent with other evidence. In the Russell case, reconstructing the family's movements became a central part of understanding the attack. The family had been returning home after attending a swimming gala. This detail became significant because it established that their presence in the area was connected to an ordinary family activity rather than a planned meeting or unusual event. The investigation found no evidence that Lynn Russell or her daughters had any known connection to the person responsible for the attack. This absence of an apparent connection created a difficult investigative challenge. When victims and offenders know one another, detectives often begin by examining personal relationships and possible motives. In cases where victims appear to have been selected randomly, investigators must instead examine a much broader range of possibilities. They must search for patterns, opportunities, and evidence that may connect an unknown person to the crime. The rural setting made the investigation both challenging and important. A countryside location can provide valuable evidence because fewer people may have been present, potentially limiting the number of individuals who could have been responsible. At the same time, fewer witnesses can also make it more difficult to establish exactly what happened. The lack of immediate eyewitness accounts meant investigators had to rely heavily on forensic examination and information gathered from the public. The weapon used in the attack became a key element of the investigation. The use of a hammer indicated a deliberate and extremely violent assault. Investigators examined whether the weapon had been brought to the scene or obtained nearby. They also considered what the choice of weapon might suggest about the offender's actions and planning. However, interpreting such evidence required caution, as assumptions about an offender's psychology could not replace physical evidence. The treatment of the victims during the attack also became part of later legal discussions. Prosecutors and investigators examined evidence that suggested the offender had taken steps to control the victims before carrying out the assault. These details contributed to the prosecution's arguments during later court proceedings. However, as with all evidence in criminal cases, interpretations depended on how information was collected, presented, and evaluated. For the local community, the attack changed the way many people viewed their surroundings. Places that had previously represented freedom and familiarity became associated with fear and uncertainty. Parents reconsidered the independence they allowed their children. Residents who had rarely thought about personal safety began paying closer attention to their environment. This reaction was not unusual after a serious crime. Communities often experience a collective response when violence occurs in a place considered safe. The psychological impact extends beyond those directly involved because it challenges the assumptions people use to understand their own lives. The Russell case created that effect not only in Chillenden but throughout Britain. As detectives continued their work, they faced the pressure of public expectation. The victims were young, the circumstances were shocking, and the demand for answers was intense. However, investigators understood that a rushed conclusion could be as damaging as having no conclusion at all. The responsibility was not merely to identify someone but to build a case supported by reliable evidence. This distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation developed. The eventual conviction of Michael Stone would later become the subject of extensive debate precisely because questions emerged about the strength and nature of the evidence used against him. The history of the case demonstrates how difficult it can be to balance the need for justice with the requirement for certainty. The initial investigation therefore represented a period of uncertainty. Police knew a devastating crime had occurred. They knew a family had been attacked while traveling through the countryside. They knew that the person responsible had escaped detection. But they did not yet know the identity of that person or how long the search for answers would continue. The next phase would move from the immediate aftermath of the attack to the discovery and examination of the crime scene. There, investigators would begin collecting the evidence that would shape the entire case: physical traces, witness accounts, and the first indications of possible investigative directions. The search for the truth would depend on their ability to turn a silent stretch of countryside into a source of answers. In the early stages of any major criminal investigation, the discovery of the scene becomes the moment when uncertainty begins to transform into evidence. Before that point, investigators are dealing with missing information, unanswered questions, and the urgency of finding out what has happened. Afterward, every detail at the location becomes part of a larger effort to reconstruct events. For the Russell case, the discovery near Chillenden, Kent, marked the beginning of one of the most extensive murder investigations in the history of the county. The location that had previously been an ordinary part of the countryside became the center of intense forensic examination. A place used by walkers and local residents was suddenly treated as a crime scene where even the smallest detail could carry importance. Police officers arriving at the area were faced with the immediate reality of the attack. Their first responsibilities were practical and procedural: securing the location, ensuring that no further danger existed, protecting possible evidence, and beginning the process of understanding what had occurred. In major investigations, the first decisions made at a scene can influence everything that follows. Evidence can be fragile, and once altered or contaminated, it may never be recovered. The surrounding environment presented both challenges and opportunities. The rural setting meant that there was a possibility that important evidence remained undisturbed. Unlike a busy public area where countless people may unknowingly affect a scene, the location near Chillenden had fewer routine movements. However, countryside environments also create difficulties. Natural conditions, including weather, vegetation, and changing ground conditions, can affect physical evidence over time. Forensic teams carefully examined the area. Their work involved documenting the scene through photographs, measurements, and detailed records. Every object, mark, and possible trace had to be considered within the wider context of the investigation. At this stage, investigators could not know which details would later become significant and which would prove unrelated. The crime scene examination was not simply about finding a weapon or a single piece of evidence that immediately identified a suspect. Real investigations rarely unfold in that way. Instead, detectives often build cases by combining many small pieces of information. A witness statement may become important when matched with forensic findings. A physical trace may only gain meaning when connected to a timeline. A seemingly minor detail can sometimes change the entire direction of an inquiry. One of the major challenges in the Russell investigation was the lack of a direct forensic link to an offender. Although evidence was collected and examined, no DNA profile directly identifying the attacker was available to investigators. This absence would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case, particularly as forensic technology advanced and questions emerged about whether additional testing might provide further information. The investigation also relied heavily on information from the public. Police issued appeals asking anyone who had been in the area around the relevant time to come forward. Investigators were interested not only in people who had witnessed the attack, but also anyone who may have noticed unusual behavior, unfamiliar vehicles, or individuals acting suspiciously. Public appeals are a common part of major investigations because detectives often need information that cannot be obtained through forensic examination alone. A person may remember seeing something that seemed meaningless at the time but becomes important after learning about the crime. For this reason, investigators often encourage people to report even uncertain memories. The scale of the response reflected the seriousness of the case. Kent police committed significant resources to the inquiry, and the investigation expanded rapidly. Officers worked through large volumes of information, attempting to separate useful evidence from background details. Thousands of interviews would eventually be conducted as detectives explored every possible lead. The emotional weight of the investigation was also significant. Officers and forensic specialists are trained to approach crime scenes professionally, but cases involving children and families often create additional challenges. The responsibility is not only to collect evidence but also to provide answers to those affected by the loss. For the Russell family's relatives, the discovery of the scene represented the beginning of a long period of uncertainty. While investigators worked to identify the person responsible, those closest to Lynn and Megan faced the reality of a loss that could not be reversed. The search for justice would continue, but it could not undo the consequences of what had happened. As the forensic examination progressed, investigators began building the foundation of their inquiry. They studied the physical evidence, reviewed witness information, and developed possible theories about the offender's actions. Yet despite the effort involved, the investigation did not immediately produce a clear suspect. The scene provided important information, but it did not provide every answer. It revealed the seriousness of the crime, helped establish parts of the sequence of events, and offered potential clues. But the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. This uncertainty would define the next stage of the case. Investigators would have to move beyond the immediate crime scene and examine the wider picture, possible suspects, public information, witness accounts, and the many investigative paths that would emerge over the following months. The search for the offender had begun, but the road toward an answer would prove far more complicated than anyone initially expected. Once the immediate response at the scene had been completed, the investigation entered a different phase. The urgency of the first hours gave way to the slower, more methodical work of analysis. Detectives now had to transform a tragic discovery into a structured investigation. They needed to determine what evidence existed, what questions remained unanswered, and which lines of inquiry offered the greatest possibility of identifying the person responsible. In a case of this scale, investigators do not begin with certainty. They begin with possibilities. The area around Chillenden became the starting point for reconstructing the events of the 9th of July, 1996. Officers examined the location carefully, considering how the offender may have approached, how the attack may have unfolded, and how the person responsible may have left the area afterward. These questions were not answered immediately. Each possibility had to be tested against available evidence. The first challenge was understanding the relationship between the victims and the offender. In many murder investigations, one of the earliest questions detectives ask is whether the victim knew the person responsible. A previous relationship can provide clues about motive, opportunity, and behavior. In the Russell case, investigators found no established connection between the family and the attacker. This meant the investigation had to consider a much wider range of possibilities. The absence of an obvious relationship also affected the way police approached potential suspects. Rather than beginning with a limited group of people connected to the family, detectives had to examine information from the wider community. They looked at individuals who may have been in the area, people with relevant histories, and anyone whose behavior or circumstances appeared unusual. The public response created both opportunities and challenges. Many people wanted to help. Residents provided information, contacted police with observations, and followed appeals for witnesses. At the same time, the enormous public interest created an environment where rumors could spread quickly. Investigators had to carefully evaluate every piece of information rather than allowing speculation to influence the direction of the inquiry. The investigation eventually became one of the largest undertaken by Kent Police. Thousands of people were interviewed, and a substantial number of statements were collected. Each interview represented another attempt to understand the circumstances surrounding the crime. Some witnesses provided information about the area. Others offered details about individuals who might be relevant. Many possibilities were examined before being eliminated. This process demonstrates one of the most difficult realities of criminal investigations: most information does not immediately lead to an answer. Detectives must often spend considerable time following leads that ultimately prove unrelated. Eliminating possibilities is not a failure, it is part of building a reliable understanding of what happened. Forensic evidence remained a central element of the inquiry. Investigators examined materials recovered from the scene and considered what information could be obtained using the scientific methods available at the time. During the mid-1990s, DNA technology was already an important tool in criminal investigations, but it was not as advanced as modern techniques. The ability to obtain and interpret genetic information from small or degraded samples was more limited than it would become in later decades. This technological context would later become important. As forensic science developed, some observers questioned whether evidence from the original investigation could provide additional information if examined using newer methods. Those questions contributed to the continuing debate surrounding the case. While forensic examination continued, detectives also explored behavioral patterns. They considered what the circumstances of the attack might indicate about the offender. However, such assessments were treated carefully. Psychological interpretations can assist investigations, but they cannot replace evidence. A theory about how an offender may have acted must always be tested against facts. The investigation also involved examining reports of suspicious activity around the time of the crime. In rural areas, unfamiliar people or vehicles can sometimes attract attention because communities often have strong awareness of who normally belongs in the area. Investigators reviewed information from members of the public who believed they may have noticed something relevant. However, identifying a person of interest is only the beginning of an investigation. Detectives must then determine whether evidence supports further action. Suspicion alone cannot establish responsibility. A criminal case requires evidence that can withstand examination in court. This distinction became especially significant in the Russell case because the eventual prosecution would later be debated extensively. The conviction of Michael Stone was based on evidence presented during trial, but critics continued to question aspects of that evidence. The discussion surrounding the case has therefore focused not only on who was suspected but also on how investigators and courts evaluated the information available. During the early investigation, however, detectives were still searching for answers. The name Michael Stone had not yet become central to public discussion. At this stage, police were dealing with an unknown offender and a large number of possible investigative directions. The crime scene had provided the first foundation, but the path forward would depend on connecting that evidence with people, timelines, and circumstances. The investigation moved outward from the quiet countryside of Chillenden into the wider community, where detectives would encounter numerous possibilities, false leads, and eventually the individual who would become the focus of the case. The search for the truth had begun, but the investigation was entering its most difficult period, the long process of identifying a suspect among thousands of possibilities. As the investigation continued, the crime scene remained the foundation upon which every later decision would be built. In a case where the identity of the offender was unknown, investigators had to rely on the information that could be recovered from the physical environment and the accounts of those who might have seen or heard something relevant. The work was painstaking. Crime scenes are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. A location that may seem to contain only a few obvious clues can hold countless details requiring examination. Investigators must consider not only what is present, but also what is missing. They must ask what should have been found, what may have been disturbed, and what evidence may have been lost before police arrived. The rural setting near Chillenden created a particular investigative environment. Unlike a busy urban street, there were fewer people passing through at any given moment. This meant there was potential for evidence to remain undisturbed. However, it also meant there were fewer independent witnesses who could provide a clear account of events. Detectives examined the surrounding area and attempted to establish the movements of everyone who might have been nearby. They were not only searching for someone who had witnessed the attack, but also for anyone who may have observed circumstances connected to it. In major investigations, valuable information often comes from unexpected sources: a person who remembers seeing an unfamiliar vehicle, someone who noticed unusual behavior, or a witness who recalls a detail that seemed insignificant at the time. The police appeal for information became a major part of the investigation. The public was asked to think carefully about their movements and observations on the day of the attack. People who had traveled through the area, walked nearby, or noticed anything unusual were encouraged to contact investigators. This approach produced a large volume of information. The challenge was determining which details were meaningful and which were unrelated. A large investigation creates a significant amount of material, but quantity does not always equal clarity. Detectives must constantly evaluate reliability, consistency, and relevance. The examination of evidence also raised questions that would remain important throughout the history of the case. The investigation did not produce a straightforward forensic link identifying the offender. There was no single piece of scientific evidence that immediately answered the central question of who was responsible. This absence shaped the direction of the inquiry. Without a definitive forensic identification, investigators had to build their understanding through a combination of evidence sources. Witness accounts, background information, behavioral analysis, and other investigative findings all became part of the process. The limitations of forensic technology in the 1990s also became significant in later years. Scientific methods have developed considerably since the original investigation, allowing older evidence to sometimes be examined in ways that were previously impossible. As a result, questions about whether modern testing could provide new information became part of the continuing discussion surrounding the case. However, forensic possibilities alone could not resolve every uncertainty. Scientific evidence must be interpreted within context. A laboratory result, a witness statement, or a suspect's background can each provide information, but criminal investigations depend on how those elements connect together. As detectives worked through the evidence, they also examined the possibility that the offender had left the area immediately after the attack and attempted to avoid detection. This raised additional questions about preparation, opportunity, and whether the person responsible had any previous knowledge of the location. Understanding an offender's actions after a crime can sometimes provide important investigative clues. Did they behave as though they knew the area? Did they attempt to hide evidence? Did they tell anyone about their actions? These questions would become relevant as investigators considered potential suspects. The investigation also required patience. Public pressure for a quick resolution was intense, especially because of the severity of the crime and the ages of the victims. Yet investigators understood that reaching the wrong conclusion could have serious consequences. The responsibility was not only to find a suspect, but to ensure that any accusation was supported by evidence. This principle would become one of the defining themes of the Russell case in later years. After Michael Stone was convicted, questions surrounding the strength of the evidence and the reliability of certain testimony continued to be debated. The case became not only a search for an offender but also a discussion about how justice systems evaluate uncertainty. At this stage, however, the investigation was still focused on finding answers. Officers continued following leads, reviewing information, and examining possible connections. The crime scene had provided the first pieces of the puzzle, but many pieces were still missing. The next stage of the investigation would move beyond the physical location and into the search for individuals who might be connected to the crime. Detectives would examine suspects, eliminate possibilities, and follow investigative paths that sometimes led nowhere. Among those many paths would eventually emerge the name that would dominate the case for decades, Michael Stone. As the investigation moved beyond the initial examination of the scene, detectives faced the most difficult stage of any major criminal inquiry, identifying a person responsible among countless possibilities. The evidence had established the seriousness of what had happened, but it had not immediately revealed who had carried out the attack. The absence of a clear connection between the victims and the offender made the search particularly challenging. Lynn Russell and her daughters appeared to have been living an ordinary family life. Investigators found no evidence of a known personal dispute or relationship that would immediately explain why they had become victims. Without an obvious motive or a clear suspect, police were forced to examine a wide range of possibilities. The investigation expanded across Kent and beyond. Officers followed up information from members of the public, reviewed witness statements, and examined the backgrounds of individuals who came to their attention. In a case attracting national attention, many names and theories emerged. Some possibilities were investigated and later dismissed. Others required extensive examination before investigators could determine whether they had any connection to the crime. This process was both necessary and difficult. In major investigations, suspicion can arise from many sources, but suspicion alone cannot establish guilt. Investigators must separate information that is relevant from information that is misleading. Every person considered as a possible suspect had to be assessed against the available evidence. The scale of the inquiry reflected the determination to examine every possible lead. Thousands of people were spoken to during the investigation. Police reviewed information from witnesses, members of the public, and individuals who believed they might have relevant knowledge. Each statement had to be considered carefully, because even a small detail could potentially change the direction of the investigation. However, the volume of information also created challenges. Large investigations can produce conflicting accounts, unreliable memories, and theories that appear convincing but cannot be supported by evidence. Detectives had to continually return to the same fundamental question: what information could be proven? During this period, several investigative avenues failed to produce a resolution. Some individuals attracted attention because of their backgrounds or circumstances, but further examination did not provide sufficient evidence connecting them to the attack. Other leads appeared significant initially but later became less relevant. These dead ends were a normal but frustrating part of the investigation. Behind every discarded theory were hours of police work, interviews, and analysis. For investigators, ruling out possibilities was progress, even when it did not immediately bring them closer to identifying the offender. The case also attracted intense media coverage. Newspapers and television programs followed developments closely, and public interest remained high. While media attention sometimes encouraged witnesses to come forward, it also created additional pressure. Investigators had to work carefully to prevent speculation from influencing the direction of the inquiry. As months passed, the lack of a definitive breakthrough became increasingly difficult for the community and the victims' relatives. The public wanted answers, and many people expected that a crime of such seriousness would quickly lead to an arrest. But criminal investigations do not always progress in a straight line. Some cases are solved through a single discovery, others develop slowly through a combination of evidence gathered over time. The investigation continued to examine possible suspects, including individuals with criminal histories. One of those individuals was Michael Stone, whose name would eventually become central to the case. At the time, however, investigators were still building their understanding of the evidence and determining whether any connection existed between him and the murders. Stone had a history of offending and drug-related problems, factors that later became part of the prosecution's arguments. However, a person's background alone cannot establish involvement in a specific crime. The challenge for investigators was determining whether there was evidence directly or indirectly connecting Stone to what happened in Chillenden. The eventual focus on Stone developed through a combination of investigative information and witness evidence rather than through a single forensic discovery. This would later become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Supporters of the conviction argued that the combined evidence presented a convincing picture. Critics questioned whether the evidence reached the standard required for such a serious conviction. Before those legal debates emerged, however, detectives were still attempting to solve the case. The investigation had moved through months of uncertainty, following leads that often ended without answers. The search required persistence, because every abandoned theory left behind the same unanswered question: who was responsible for the deaths of Lynn and Megan Russell and the attack on Josie Russell? The turning point would come when investigators began gathering information that brought Michael Stone closer to the center of the inquiry. That development would transform the investigation from a search for an unknown offender into a legal battle over evidence, reliability, and responsibility. The next stage of the case would examine how Stone became the primary suspect, the evidence presented against him, and the events that led to one of the most controversial convictions in modern British criminal history. As the months passed, the investigation into the Russell murders entered a new and more complex stage. The initial search had involved a vast number of possibilities, but gradually detectives began narrowing their focus. In major criminal investigations, this process often occurs slowly. A suspect does not usually emerge because of one dramatic discovery. Instead, investigators build a picture from many different pieces of information, some strong, some uncertain, and some that eventually lead nowhere. The Russell case followed this difficult pattern. Police continued examining information from the public, reviewing witness statements, and assessing individuals who came to their attention. Every possible connection had to be considered carefully. A person's past, behavior, or reputation could make them worthy of investigation, but it could not by itself prove involvement in a specific crime. One of the individuals who eventually became central to the inquiry was Michael Stone. Stone was known to police before the Russell murders because of a history involving criminal behavior and drug-related problems. His background attracted attention, but investigators still needed evidence connecting him to the events in Chillenden. The transition from considering someone as a possible suspect to building a prosecution case requires a significant amount of investigation. Stone's name entered the investigation during a period when police were still searching for answers. The case had already generated enormous public pressure, and detectives were under intense scrutiny to identify the person responsible. However, the seriousness of the crime also meant that any suspect would require careful examination. The evidence that eventually brought Stone to trial did not consist of a single piece of forensic proof directly linking him to the scene. Instead, the prosecution relied on a combination of evidence, including testimony from individuals who claimed Stone had made statements about the crime and other information presented during the legal proceedings. This would later become one of the most debated elements of the case. In criminal trials, evidence is examined not only for what it suggests but also for how reliable it is. Witness testimony can be powerful, particularly when it provides information unavailable from other sources. However, courts must also consider issues such as memory, motivation, consistency, and whether statements can be independently supported. The case against Stone therefore depended heavily on how a jury evaluated the available evidence. Prosecutors argued that the evidence, considered as a whole, demonstrated that Stone was responsible. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case and questioned the reliability of some evidence presented against him. Before reaching the courtroom, however, investigators continued their work. They examined Stone's movements, his background, and any information that could either support or contradict the allegations against him. The process involved reviewing details from multiple sources and determining whether they formed a coherent explanation of what had happened. The investigation also demonstrated the difficulty of solving crimes without direct forensic identification. In modern cases, DNA evidence can sometimes provide a clear link between an offender and a crime scene. But in the Russell investigation, no DNA evidence directly identifying Stone as the attacker was available. This limitation became increasingly important as forensic science advanced and later discussions examined whether additional testing could provide new information. The public reaction to Stone's arrest was intense. Many people believed that the investigation had finally reached a conclusion. After months of uncertainty, the identification of a suspect appeared to offer a sense of closure. For the victims' relatives and the wider community, the possibility of justice being achieved carried enormous significance. However, criminal investigations do not end with an arrest. An arrest begins another process, the examination of evidence in court. A suspect must face legal scrutiny, and the prosecution must demonstrate guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The first trial of Michael Stone became a major event. The court was asked to examine the evidence and determine whether the prosecution had proven that Stone was responsible for the murders. The arguments presented during the trial would later become central to decades of discussion about the case. In 1998, Stone was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. For many observers, the verdict represented the conclusion of a long and painful investigation. The families affected by the crime had received a legal judgment, and the public was given an explanation for one of the country's most shocking crimes. Yet the story did not end with that verdict. Almost immediately, questions remained among some legal commentators and observers about the strength of certain evidence. The lack of direct forensic evidence became a recurring issue. So did concerns about the reliability of some testimony used during the prosecution. These questions would eventually lead to further legal challenges and another examination of the case. The conviction that appeared to close the investigation would instead become the beginning of a much longer debate about evidence, justice, and whether the correct person had been held responsible. The next chapter would examine that turning point, the evidence presented at trial, the challenges to the conviction, and the legal process that transformed the Russell case from a solved murder investigation into one of Britain's most controversial criminal cases. The investigation into the murders of Lynn and Megan Russell reached a critical point when Michael Stone became the central figure in the case. After months of uncertainty, detectives had moved from searching for an unknown offender to examining one individual whose background and circumstances had drawn significant attention. Yet identifying a suspect and proving a case against that suspect are two very different stages of a criminal investigation. The evidence surrounding Stone would become the foundation of one of the most closely examined trials in British criminal history. It would also become the source of decades of debate. Supporters of the conviction argued that the evidence presented a convincing picture when viewed as a whole. Critics questioned whether the evidence was sufficiently reliable and whether alternative explanations had been fully considered. At the heart of the prosecution case was testimony from individuals who claimed that Stone had made statements connecting himself to the murders. These witnesses became important because, without a direct forensic link between Stone and the crime scene, their accounts provided a significant part of the prosecution's argument. However, witness testimony in serious criminal cases must always be examined carefully. Courts consider not only what a witness says, but also how the information was obtained, when it was reported, whether it remained consistent over time, and whether there are reasons to question its reliability. These issues became central to later discussions about the Russell case. Another important factor was the absence of direct forensic evidence. The investigation had recovered and examined physical material from the crime scene, but no DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence, or other definitive scientific link established Stone as the offender. This did not prevent a conviction, because criminal cases can be proven through different types of evidence. However, the lack of direct forensic identification remained one of the main reasons the case continued to attract scrutiny. The prosecution presented the argument that the combination of evidence pointed toward Stone's guilt. They argued that the various elements of the case supported one another and created a consistent explanation of what had happened. The defense, however, challenged this interpretation and argued that the evidence was insufficient and unreliable. The trial required the jury to evaluate competing versions of events. Like all juries in criminal cases, they were asked to consider whether the prosecution had proven guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Their decision would determine whether Stone would be held legally responsible for the deaths of Lynn and Megan Russell and the attack on Josie Russell. In 1998, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Stone was convicted and received a life sentence. For many members of the public, the verdict appeared to bring an end to a case that had caused widespread fear and grief. After years of investigation and uncertainty, there was a legal conclusion. However, within the justice system, a conviction is not necessarily the final stage of a case. Legal processes allow convictions to be challenged if concerns arise about evidence, procedure, or fairness. In Stone's case, those challenges would eventually become significant. The first conviction was later examined through the appeals process. Concerns were raised regarding aspects of the evidence used during the trial, particularly relating to the reliability of testimony. In 2001, the original conviction was overturned, and a retrial was ordered. This development changed the public understanding of the case. What had appeared to be a completed investigation was now facing renewed examination. The central question returned: was Michael Stone responsible for the crime, and had the evidence against him been properly evaluated? During the retrial, prosecutors again presented their case. The defense continued to challenge the evidence and questioned whether the prosecution had established Stone's guilt to the required legal standard. After considering the evidence, the jury once again found Stone guilty, and he was again sentenced to life imprisonment. The second conviction meant that, legally, the case had reached another conclusion. However, public discussion did not disappear. The reason was that the questions surrounding the evidence remained topics of debate. Over the following years, journalists, legal commentators, and campaigners examined different aspects of the case. Some focused on the testimony used during the trials. Others questioned whether modern forensic techniques could provide additional answers. The debate was not simply about whether Stone was guilty or innocent. It was also about how courts should evaluate evidence when direct scientific proof is unavailable. The Russell case became an example frequently discussed in relation to the complexity of criminal justice. It demonstrated how difficult it can be to achieve certainty in cases where evidence is largely based on interpretation rather than a single decisive discovery. As years passed, advances in forensic science changed the landscape of criminal investigation. Techniques that were unavailable during the original inquiry became possible, leading some observers to argue that old evidence should be reviewed using modern methods. This possibility contributed to continuing interest in the case. At the same time, investigators and legal authorities maintained that the conviction remained valid unless changed through the proper legal process. The difference between public debate and legal judgment became increasingly important. A case can continue to attract questions while a conviction remains legally in force. The investigation into the Russell murders therefore entered a new phase. The question was no longer only who had committed the crime, but also how confidently the justice system could answer that question decades later. The next stage of the story would examine the legal battles that followed, the evidence reconsidered during appeals, and the breakthrough developments that continued to shape the debate surrounding one of Britain's most controversial murder convictions.